The Haunting Tales of Dark Shivering. Visiting Dark Shivering every week back in the 1980s on business meant that I came to know its history and people quite well. For every house, building and street there was a ghostly tale to tell. Here are just a few of them to enjoy. The Dogman. Every village and town has its unusual residents. They're known for maybe their odd behavior or beliefs, and Dark Shivering was no different. One of their unusual villages was a man called Charlie. Charlie lived on a rather large property, consisting of a farmhouse, with outbuildings, barns, and covered over 200 acres of land. He used the land for various purposes, from farming and crops, to storing people's caravans. It was the latter use that I happened upon in the winter of 1985. Whilst staying at the Dark Shivering Inn, I had met Charlie many times in the bar in the evening, and chatted away happily for hours. This particular time, however, I had made a mistake with my booking, and neglected to increase my night's stay, when another work meeting cropped up on that particular trip. Luck was on my side that evening, however, as Charlie was sat in the bar and offered me to stay the night in one of the many empty caravans on his property. I couldn't have been any more grateful, and offered to pay for the inconvenience. It was saving me over 100 miles round trip to have to come back the next day for a meeting. Charlie insisted it was no problem and warmly invited me to follow him in my car to his house. It wasn't too far to get to Charlie's property. The lane that led up to his house was more of a gravel track with plenty of potholes and puddles to try and avoid. But we made it there in about 20 minutes. Just before a huge rain and thunderstorm broke out overhead, we both dashed to the front door, and even in those few seconds we were both drenched and glad to get inside. Once we went in, two dogs came to welcome us. I could see they had been sat by a warm oven in the kitchen, as both dog beds were pushed up close to it. We sat in the warm kitchen drying off and drinking a hot drink. I could see that the house looked very run down, and Charlie probably lived mainly in the kitchen. He told me himself that the bedrooms upstairs were not lived in. It had been his parents' property before his, and the bedrooms were full of a mixture of old antiques and rubbish. Sorting him out was on his to-do list, but I had a feeling the list might have been lost in one of the bedrooms never to be seen again. As we chatted, both of his dogs jumped up and became restless. They both came and sat by Charlie's legs and insisted on being petted by him. I asked if they were okay, and he chuckled and said they'd probably heard the Dogman outside. When Charlie first said this, I thought he was joking and so laughed. He went on to state matter-of-factly that there was a story about a Dogman roaming his property back when he was a child in the 1930s. It was all I could do to not spit my drink out in shock, as I realized that I was going to be spending the night in a paper-thin caravan, in the middle of a stormy night on a Dogman property. Charlie could see the obvious concern on my face, and attempted to ease my fears by waving his hands and saying it was probably just a dog that was feral and scaring people. As grateful as I was of his attempt to backtrack on what he'd told me, I had to state the obvious and tell him that even feral dogs run on 4 legs. Only dogmen and werewolves walk on 2. I told him if I was to be staying the night, I'd rather know what had happened in the area rather than be caught unawares. He looked a bit uncomfortable at this request, but awkwardly went on to tell me what he'd heard and experienced over the years. He said that back when he was a child he had a vague memory of being outside late at night with his parents. It was late summer and they had been working all day. They'd been so busy chatting and enjoying the evening that they hadn't realized how dark and cold it had gone. So they began packing up their chairs and carrying in their plates and cups. Charlie was busy trying to balance the crockery when a commotion began around him. It all happened so fast, but he could hear his mother panicking and his dad shouting to get in the house. Before he had time to react to what was happening around him, his mother crashed into him from behind and grabbed him, pushing him inside the front door. His mother and father were shouting and scrambling around to close windows and doors. Charlie was afraid but too young to understand what was going on. In his child's mind, he thought a grizzly bear was trying to get in the house. He remembers that once the house was secure, his mother took him up to bed and made him sleep in with her whilst his father seemingly stayed up all night. As kids do, he soon forgot about the ordeal and just assumed it was an animal of some sort that had gotten loose, and his mum and dad didn't want it getting in the house. After that night, though, it became common practice to be inside the house by darkfall. It was a few years later, when he was a teenager, that Charlie overheard a conversation between his father and a neighbor that brought back memories of that unusual night when he was a child. The two men didn't know Charlie was listening in on their conversation, but they were stood outside of the barn he was in, and so he couldn't help but overhear most of what was said. The neighbor was telling his father that all of his sheep had been slaughtered the night before. He was asking Charlie's father if he had had any such attack on his farm. But Charlie's father told the neighbor that he hadn't kept any livestock on his farm for years due to some similar and sinister situations going on. The neighbor seemed unsure as to what he meant, and so proceeded to ask if he meant a purposeful attack by another person. But Charlie's father's answer didn't just shock the neighbor, it shocked Charlie too. He told the neighbor in earnest that he refused to keep any more animals on the farm because a large creature that looked to be half man and half dog kept coming on the property and killing them. The dogman had also taken to coming close to the house, and so he had sold all his remaining animals. Since doing that, he hadn't seen the dogman on his property for years. The neighbor was understandably shocked and seemed to leave with an understanding that maybe a wolf was on the loose. But that was not what Charlie's dad had described at all. The idea of a dogman seemed a bit far-fetched to me and reminded me of the old black and white werewolf movies. I wondered if this is why the villagers thought of Charlie as a bit unusual. Maybe he had told them of this dogman, and they thought he was mad. Although I was unbelieving of a dogman at this point, I was still interested in his story and quite happily let him continue. He said that if he ever brought up the subject of that frightening night when he was a child, his parents would both dismiss it as nothing important. He thought they didn't want him to be afraid to live there. His mother and father had died a good 20 years ago, back in the 1960s. It was on his mother's deathbed that she spoke of this creature for the first time with Charlie. She told him that all those years ago they had been stalked by a dogman-type creature. They had seen it often when they had animals. It hid in the shadows watching the farm. Sometimes in the middle of the night they heard it circling their farmhouse. Charlie's dad would look out the windows and watch as this dogman glided effortlessly around the building, making grunting and deathly noises. They never saw it again after all the farm animals were gone. But sometimes they would hear noises coming from the barn in the middle of the night, as if it was searching for its next victim. Charlie said that he had never seen any dogman creature in his lifetime living on the farm. But also he had never kept animals there either, only his dogs for company. It was getting late now and the rain had subsided slightly, so I could make a dash for the caravan Charlie had promised me. I told him to stay inside the house in the warm and that I'd find my way easily enough. He'd given me directions and said it was the first caravan on the left. I could see quite easily where I was going. The lights from the farmhouse lit up far enough that I could walk confidently without losing my way. As I walked towards the left-hand side, I could see that there was a row of 6 caravans to my right. On the left side, however, the caravans were all stored within the barns. This at least gave me shelter from the rain and wind whilst I fumbled with the door. I managed to get inside and make myself comfortable, and it was coming up to midnight when I got myself in bed. As I lay by the window, I looked out towards the farmhouse and could see that Charlie had switched all the lights off and was probably asleep in the warm with his dogs. It seemed a little creepier outside now without the welcoming glow of the house lights, but I managed to roll over and fall asleep. I had been asleep for over an hour and it was coming up to 2 a.m. in the morning when I was terrified to be awoken by loud banging noises outside the caravan. I was half asleep and couldn't quite process where I was or what was happening. It took me a few seconds to remember where I was. I felt annoyed and thought maybe Charlie was up early banging about working inside the barn. But I checked my watch and could see it was only 1:45 a.m. I looked out through my window and could see the house was still in darkness, but the banging from the back of the barn continued on. My mind was racing, wondering what could be making the noise. Was it a wild boar rooting about for food? Was it a burglar trying to steal a caravan? Was it a caravan owner wanting to get his caravan? I just didn't know, and so as I sat there thinking about it, the noises suddenly stopped. After sitting there a while in silence just waiting to hear a pin drop, I decided to go and see what it was that had made all the noise. In my head I was pretty much set on it being a wild boar. But my blood ran cold as I got to the door. I was just about to open it and go outside when a massive creature walked past the window. It looked like a monster. It had to be over 7 foot tall because I couldn't see its head. I could just see a huge chest covered in fur. I wanted to dive under my bed covers, but I was frozen to the spot. I must have been stuck there with my eyes running for what seemed like forever. But as I gained some movement back in my body, I leaned forward to look out of the door window again. There was nothing there. I could see the caravan next to mine when suddenly a face rose up from underneath the window. My eyes were fixated on the face of a Dogman, and as the horror built up inside me, it opened its mouth and snarled. That was obviously too much for me. I must have passed out in sheer terror. The next thing I remember, it was daylight. I was lay awkwardly between the units on the hard floor and the steps to the door. I was unsure of what had happened at first. I thought maybe it was a dream. I decided to get up and leave even though it was before 6 a.m. in the morning. The farmhouse was in silence, and so I pushed an envelope through Charlie's letterbox. It had some money in and a note saying I'd see Charlie the next time I was in Dark Shivering. I decided to head back over to the Dark Shivering Inn, as I could sit and have some breakfast there even at that early hour. As was usual, I chatted away to the waitress whilst she brought out cereals and pastries. I told her about forgetting to book my room with them the night before, and she laughed and said that she'd heard I had gone to stay at Charlie's farm. She said the staff had spoken about it the previous evening and wondered if they'd ever see me again. I laughed and assured her that although Charlie was a bit unusual, he wasn't a mass murderer or anything. But she looked at me and said she didn't know if he was a murderer or not, but 2 other people had gone to stay at Charlie's farm in the last few years, and both of them were missing. A shiver went up my spine. I finished my coffee, and for the first time ever was glad to be leaving Dark Shivering. Dark Shivering has lots more stories to give up, and I'm always collecting them for future books. Join me next time for more haunting tales of Dark Shivering. Don't forget to click like and subscribe so you never miss another ghostly episode.